Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, January 28th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start doing a little bit of a fun exercise. I'll do if I was the college football commissioner. I'll break down my scheduling ideas, CFP ideas, portal, and governance, and we'll probably get into a couple more of these things a little bit deeper in the week, probably get into a little bit more detail, but wanted to give you guys a little bit of an idea of what I would do if I was the commissioner of this sport. Then we'll get into the first-year head coaches, get into a couple grades for them. I have 8 coaches here, still a couple more that I didn't have a chance to get to, but definitely some big-time head coaches, especially Kurt Cignetti, kind of setting the way for the first-year head coaches. Then we'll get to the teams with the most to prove in 2025. We did this yesterday. Want to follow it over to today because I think there's a lot of other teams that I didn't quite get to. And then we'll finish it off. We'll do my favorite portal pickups on the offense, and then in the fifth segment, we'll do the defense. We'll kind of do all the portal stuff at the very end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that, and we can have a fun back and forth throughout the show. But let's jump into this, and let's talk about what I would do if I was the college football commissioner. There's a lot of stuff, I'll be totally honest with you. So I'm only going to get into 4 major categories. I'm going to get into scheduling, I'm going to get into the CFP, the portal, and kind of just the governance overall of college football. Obviously, there's much more details to get to. NIL and all of that stuff is a totally different mountain to climb, a different day. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and we'll start with one of the rather easier ones of the bunch, in my opinion, and that's just the scheduling throughout the season. And this doesn't necessarily mean the entire calendar of college football, because that's something we can get into throughout the next couple of segments, or next couple of sections. But when I look at the college football world we have right now, the fact that we play different schedules throughout the country is just ridiculous. Now, there are going to be harder schedules in the SEC and the Big Ten comparative to the Big 12 and the ACC. That's just inevitable. But the idea that we play totally different structures of games, totally different structures of schedules, is just ridiculous. And the way that I see it, I think the best way to put it is you have 9 plus 2 plus 1. That's the format we go forward with. You have 9 conference games, you have 2 conference games against other power conferences, and then you have 1 group of 5 opponent. Now, there's some wiggle room if you wanted to do 1-2, if you want to do 1 power conference and 2 group of 5 games. I could get on board with that, but at the end of the day, I think 9 conference games is the most important part of this. We have to have every conference playing the same amount of games. Now, I understand that, yes, the SEC, a 9-game schedule in the SEC is harder than a 9-game schedule in the ACC or the Big 12. That is undeniable, but the reality of the sport is we need more data points. We need more idea of where these teams are, and we don't need a scenario where we go into the last week where we don't know any of the scenarios going in the Big 12, going in the SEC for that championship game, because we're all very, very confused about how everything plays out, about the tiebreakers, about everything in between. You had one more data point to that SEC schedule. A lot of that is cleaned up before the last weekend. You have a little bit more ability to kind of plan this stuff and make sure you're in good standing and not confuse teams back and forth all throughout the year. So I do think it's one of those things that it just feels like a layup to me. I understand the SEC is going to push for this very aggressively against this, and I totally get that. But at the end of the day, it just makes sense. All these teams playing 9 conference games just makes sense. I want more conference games. I want them to meet a little bit more, and I want all of those games to really hold a lot of weight for everyone that's playing them. So I do think that's a pretty easy slam dunk, if I'm being honest. As far as the group of 5 compared to the power conference, I prefer more power conference games because I want more data points between these conferences. I want to know without a doubt who the best conference in the country is, because this year it seemed to be the Big Ten, and then you go back to the regular season, you see there's 7 teams in the SEC that were in the top 15 to end the year. So there were a lot of really great teams over in the SEC and in the Big Ten. I want to see them play each other more. I want to see them play the ACC and the Big 12 more. So I think 2 conference games against other power conferences will do you a lot of good. Also, no FCS games. I apologize to the FCS, but the reality is there are other ways to keep them financially subsidized without them playing the games in the fall and without these teams getting essentially a bye week before they play their rivalry game. So that feels like a pretty easy one to me. Now, we'll talk about the CFP schedule and all of that with Army-Navy. That's a precarious situation and one we need to very badly figure out, because if Army and Navy were to get to the CFP, How would that be handled? That's a huge conversation and definitely something we need to discuss, but let's go ahead and get into that a little bit. Let's talk about the CFP and what I would do with it. So, the biggest thing here is I would go back to 8, maybe even 6 teams, if I'm being totally honest. That's the way that I think this thing should go. I think there's probably 8 teams every single year that are really national title worthy. Now, there's been some years where there's only 2 or there's only 3, but the reality is I think 8 or 6 are probably the right number. Let's work in reality here for a second, because even if I was commissioner tomorrow, I'm not getting enough support to drop this thing back down to 8 or drop it back down to 6. So you're going to have to build from it. You're going to have to go to more teams. And as I see it, I think 16 is the right number. I like 12. I like 14. I don't think it's quite what 16 is. And I think it really takes out a lot of the weird advantages / disadvantages of having a bye, of having, not playing your conference championship, but getting into that first round and like Ohio State did and having kind of a pseudo bye, if you will. So there's a lot of different things that go into having bye weeks that I don't think we necessarily need. If you have the 1 seed playing the 16 seed and you have the 2 seed playing the 15, I really don't think they need a bye. I don't think they need anything else helping them out along the way. Also, the first 2 rounds, I think, would be home games for the higher seed. I think that adds a little bit to the games. I think it brings a little bit of energy to these things, and I think it makes these players play a little bit harder early in the regular season because you want one of those top 8 seeds. You want to make sure that you're in a position to play a home game in your second round if you were to win. So that's something we can talk about. Should conference champions get into those top 8 seeds so they can get 2 home games? That's definitely a debate, definitely something that can be discussed. But overall, I wouldn't have any auto bids. Frankly, like in my ideal scenario, I wouldn't have any auto bids. I also would be overhauling the ranking system as far as I'm concerned. For the CFP especially, I wouldn't release rankings until probably, I'm trying to figure it out right now. Probably sometime in November, I'd probably release the first rankings. Then I'd release another one probably 2 or 3 weeks after that, and then I'd release the final one. I would not do every single week because I think it creates problems. I think people overthink in that room. I think they drop teams a little bit too far for certain losses or pop teams up a little bit too far for certain wins. So I think spreading it out for 2 or 3 weeks between the rankings is going to be more helpful, and it's going to make it so we don't have these huge reactionary polls that jump, it's like the best example that I have is Georgia losing to Ole Miss this past year and dropping 9 places in the rankings, although Ole Miss was a top 10 team. That's something that shouldn't happen, plain and simple. And if you waited a couple more weeks, Georgia would have beaten Florida. They would have been beaten Tennessee, and then they would have found their footing, and you're looking back and saying, okay, we can probably keep them where they should be. And that totally makes sense to me. That's something that I would absolutely do. I also would try to overhaul the preseason rankings. I would try to get rid of those as best I can because I think it creates a little bit of a bias towards certain teams that last the entire year. But in terms of the schedule of this thing, it's really tough because you have conference championship week. First of all, I would push it up 1 week the entire season and then give them another bye week. Wouldn't change the end of the year by any means. So we're still working from that November or December 7th, at least this year, was the conference champion. The first Saturday in December is the conference championship week. And then from there, I think you go first round would be on Army-Navy week. So that's something that would have to be figured out. Do you want to move it to week 0? Do you want to move it to maybe rivalry weekend and just give it a little bit more of a pedestal? It's a complicated issue. There's no doubt about that. I still want that game to get as much love as it deserves, but when you're looking at the schedule right now, it's way too spread out. It's way too much, and we're going to have to use that Saturday one way or the other. So that's something to think about. The 14th, maybe the 13th and the 14th, use that Friday as well. Quarterfinals, the exact same thing. The 20th and the 21st. Semifinals, I think you just play them on the first. You play, a Rose Bowl or you play whoever on that first, and then take 10 days, play the championship on that Saturday of the 11th. And this would obviously change next year, the dates of all this, but at the end of the day, why not play it on a Saturday? I really don't understand it. You could play it on the 13th, I suppose, but at the end of the day, I fully believe that playing this thing on a Saturday is the way it should go, and you're probably going to have to work with the NFL on some of this scheduling stuff, but the reality is, it seems like they're coming to the table right now, and the NFL is more than happy to maximize their income or maximize college football's income as long as it keeps their pockets plenty full as well. So I don't really see an issue with this. I don't see a negative to this, and you could do some great things with the portal with this as well, and that's the other part of this. The transfer portal is a problem. There's no doubt about that. There's a lot of different things about it that are great. There's some things about it that are just downright terrible. There's no doubt. And I think you look at, in my ideal world, these kids would sign 1, 2, or 3 year contracts. That's the way that it would go. and you would get, depending on, how long you were staying, what your position was, whatever, you would get a certain amount of money per year. Then you would at least know who the guys are. You would know who the guys are that could leave, that want to leave after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years, and then you can at least have conversations. Now, I do think a lot of kids, at least initially, would go towards the 1 year contracts. I think they would keep their options open and then they would move forward. But then you would see the horror stories. You would see guys make mistakes, as we've seen throughout the portal life thus far. And I think guys would start to opt for that second year, for that 3rd-year contract that just makes more sense for them. So I do think that just makes sense overall. I think these guys have to sign contracts. We're already down the rabbit hole of them being professional athletes. The fact that we're not signing very binding contracts at this point is insane. Now, we are doing revenue sharing and that type of thing. Frankly, I don't know if there's enforceable rules behind all of that, and I don't know if the NCAA can step up and really hold these kids accountable to those contracts. So that's a whole other problem that will go into the governance that we'll talk about here in a second. But overall, I think the bigger thing here is I think you have a wide opening between the semifinal of the CFP to the final, so the 1st to the 11th, 10 days. Kids can get in the portal in that time. That's just the reality of this situation. And then the title teams, you give 5 more days or 7 more days or what have you. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a tight portal cycle, but it should be. The portal shouldn't be this thing that we open up for a month or 2 months at a time and say, say jump in, do whatever you need, talk to other schools, tamper, do all of that stuff. It's got to be 10 days. It does not have to be longer than that. These kids can make their setup, make sure that they're in a good place, and then walk out the door. That's the way that this should go, and then you can find your new place in that 10 days. And if you don't, you have a little bit more time after the championship to do that, but the reality that we're giving guys a 28-day period to get into the portal is just insane. Give them a 10-day period to get in, and then we'll work out the rest of the recruiting on the back end. So that just makes more sense to me. It would make the coach's job a whole lot easier, and would make things just a little bit cleaner in the scheduling. And then for governance, this is the biggest part of this, and one that I haven't really figured out. I'll be totally honest with you. I think there are some great ideas out there. I think there are some truly terrible ideas out there, but at the end of the day, I can look at this every which way. The only way that this works is college football getting outside of the NCAA. I think the NCAA has done a great job in the past and has done about as good as they could do in certain respects in the NIL era. Now, they should have been doing this 15 years earlier, and then maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation, but overall, it just can't happen anymore. They can't keep up with what college football is doing. College football can't deal with what the NCAA has to deal with. We have to move forward. This is a full-on professional sport. Other college sports, not so much at this point. So we have to move forward. We have to move beyond the NCAA. Maybe the CFP takes over as a kind of governing body, and that makes total sense to me. Then you got to get into the players' union. I think that has to be a thing because we're watching agents take advantage of kids left and right. We're asking kids to pay 20% agent fees. You should never be paying that. If there's a recruit watching this and someone says you should pay a 20% agent fee, they're lying to you, plain and simple. And it's something that we have to figure out. We have to give these guys, former players, former coaches, people to bounce off of to say, that is ridiculous. That is not the way that this should go. That is not the way any of this should go, and have these guys move forward with confidence. That's the biggest thing about this is we have to make sure that this player empowerment movement is being utilized in the right scope. We have to make sure that they're being put in the right position going forward, and if we don't, then we're not doing the good thing for the sport or the players. So I think a players' union is pretty much inevitable in some respects, but I think it's got to happen pretty quickly. And then that leaves the commissioner issue. What's going on, Anthony? Nice to see you. But that does bring up the commissioner issue. Do you want the guy to kind of lead the way with an iron fist? You don't need one guy, plain and simple. I think we've all seen what could happen if you have one guy steering a sport, and you don't want that. I think you have to have kind of a board of people, and Nick Saban has said he doesn't want to be the commissioner. I think he very well could be a part of that group. 15 to 20 people, let's say, former coaches, former players, some NIL types, maybe some lawyers, maybe some media people, whoever it is. It's got to be people that love this game. There's so much in this world that is so confusing, that is so out of this world, that is so just annoying, is the best way to put it, if I'm being totally honest. But the reality is, there has never been a bigger time in college football and in college sports in general where there are more people paying attention to the problem, where there are more people saying we have to fix this, and there are more people saying we got to take action, including Nick Saban, including a lot of former head coaches. I think you could very easily get Nick Saban, Jim Tressel, Mac Brown, a lot of these former head coaches to say, at least give their 2 cents. Maybe they're not sitting on the board every single year, but at least they're a part of this conversation. And the reality is, I know a lot of things about a lot of people that are doing this stuff. The one thing I know about those 3 guys and a lot of former head coaches is they care about these players and they care about the game that they're coaching. And that's the biggest part about this, is you have to find a way to. Yeah, and Anthony, you're absolutely right. The reality is conferences are, I don't want to say a problem in modern day college football, but the idea of conferences being their own entities and having totally different rules, totally different officiating staffs, totally different everything just doesn't do the sport any good. It makes things very confusing. It very much hurts the sports overall, and you do want the conferences to be specific on the field, off the field. They should have all the same rules. There's no doubt about that. And then the NFL just has to get involved at some point, as far as I'm concerned, Anthony, whether it's from a scheduling perspective with the CFP, that's almost a given, but even from an NIL perspective, maybe I was talking about that 10 to 15 people, wouldn't be a bad idea at all to bring a couple of NFL guys down to help out with a changing world, no doubt about that. But overall, the governance of the sport is going to be complicated. There's going to be a lot of people with a lot of ideas. There are going to be some people that are just looking to make a quick buck off this sport. We have to find the people that aren't. We have to find the people that care about these kids, that care about the sport, and move forward with them. The reality is, I'd love to be the college football commissioner. I don't necessarily think I'm too qualified to be the college football commissioner. So it's a great thought exercise. I'm more than happy to help if anyone wants help throughout the next little bit. But the reality is, the biggest thing in the sport, the biggest problem in the sport, is the people running the sport right now don't love it. The people running the sport right now don't see these players as real commodities, as real commodities in this sport. They just don't. That's the reality. They want to make the most money they can. We have to find people in there that are willing to say no to money and willing to say yes to the health of the sport, plain and simple. And it won't be as hard to do as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So that's going to be an awesome thing to watch. Obviously, if I was commissioner, I wouldn't just have one commissioner. I would have multiple. I'd have a board to kind of go along with me, and it'd be filled with former players, former coaches, NFL people, NIL people, whoever I need to make sure that we put this sport on the best track possible, and we make sure that it's all about the players and the most important parts of the sport, the players and the coaches. So we'll get into that in more detail probably later in the week, but let's take our first break here. And when we come back, let's talk about first-year head coaches. Let's give some grades to guys like Sharon Moore, Kurt Signetti, and Jed Fish. We'll get into all of that right after this, so stick with us.